our next speaker, Professor Zbigniew Stawrowski, will talk about the theories developed by John Paul II in legal matters. Also, I'm told that he's going to be late, so we'll jump right away to the next. Oh, here he is. So he will be able to start. Welcome, Professor. I was just introducing you, so if that's fine with you, you can start. So I was saying that you're going to discuss the theories developed by John Paul II in legal matters. Professor Stawrowski is a political philosopher, professor at the Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw, and director of the Tischner Institute in Krakow, Poland. He is the author of a number of books, among which The State and Its Rights, In the Philosophy of Hegel, Natural Law and Political Order, and The Clash of Civilizations or Civil War, and more recently in 2020, Solidarity Means a Bond. Professor Stawrowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for my being late. I've just come from Krakow with Professor Weiler, who will be tomorrow here. My outline of the most important threads of John Paul II teaching on the law, I would like to begin with two general remarks. First of all, I would like to dealing with the, I would like, just a moment. Okay. First of all, we are not dealing with the considerations of a certain philosopher or theologian. As what John Paul II, as the Pope, has said, thank you, about law, can be by no means be reduced to self-reliant creative thoughts of Karol Wojtyła, but it is rather a part of and continuation of the social doctrine of Catholic Church. This in turn means the reflection of a community in which the main determinant is a sense of responsibility for the community and of a prudence associated with it. This teaching contains a set of tried and tested principles by which human society should be guided. The reflections of the community understood in this way has many sources and many fathers. I'm not merely referring to the fact that the documents signed by the Pope were prepared by a team of his co-workers. What is much more important is the fact that John Paul II's teaching, as part of the social doctrine of the Church, is situated within a living tradition and constantly refers to the works of his predecessors, popes, fathers of the Church, the teachings of councils. This is precisely the point. This tradition is living, which means that as the historical context changes, new challenges appear, as do new ways of interpreting and applying these lasting principles to which his teaching constantly refers. John Paul II also plays his part as the evangelical father of a household who brought out from his treasury what was new and what was old. He enriched the teaching of the Church with new intuition, a new approach, and new emphasis. The second remark concerns the audience to whom the Pope's teaching is addressed. The Church social doctrine belongs to the field of moral theology, but this does not mean that its content is intended only for theologians and Catholics. This teaching is not limited to presenting a set of revealed truths, but refer most of all to obvious, rational, and coherent arguments that can reach all people of goodwill. In other words, the topics which arise within this teaching and which refer to basis questions, who is man and what shape interpersonal relations should take, are presented in a universal language that speaks to every being endowed with reason, a language in which the fundamental category as a philosophical concept, the concept of natural law. It should therefore be of no surprise that reflection on the established law is neither the proper nor the primary subject of interest in papal teaching. It is only possible to formulate here a general principle. Laws and other established legal acts should remain in harmony with the general rules derived from natural law. This conviction, which was, after all, already present in the works of ancient philosophers, was developed in the 13th century by a doctor of the church and a classical thinker of natural law, to which John Paul II repeatedly refers. I quote from Evangelium Vitae: "The doctrine on the necessary conformity of civil law with the moral law is the clear teaching of Saint Thomas Aquinas." And quotation in quotation, "Human law is law inasmuch as it is in conformity with right reason and thus derives from the eternal law. But when a law is contrary to reason, it is called an unjust law. But in this case, it ceases to be a law and becomes instead an act of violence." And further, "Every law made by man can be called a law insofar as it derives from the natural law. But if it is somehow opposed to the natural law, then it is not really a law, but rather a corruption of the law." End quote. This approach is, of course, not specifically only for Christians. It is shared among other religious and philosophical traditions which perceive and accept the existing natural order of things. The recognition and proper description of this order and its eternal rational laws is therefore a crucial matter. Two possible ways of recognizing these laws open up here. The first is by way of reason. The second is through revelation. The first, open to all, reveals to us nature's laws, which rule over the world of nature, and natural laws, which describe the proper order for interpersonal relations. The second way, which searches for these laws in the word spoken by God and written down by the inspired writers of the Holy Scriptures, is open only to those who trust in the revelation. In both cases, however, we are concerned with the same eternal, unchanging, rational laws. For example, the commandments contained in the Decalogue, at least in its second table, were not given arbitrarily, but were a concise reminder and confirmation of these laws which have been written on the hearts of every human being, and which every human being, guided by reason, can recognize as the proper principles of righteous conduct. In his teaching, John Paul II refers to both the first and the second way. The text of the Holy Scriptures and the comments referring to them, which over the centuries have become part of the church tradition, are accompanied by rational argument that can also be understood by those who maintain their distance to the language of revelation. It can be said that the more the papal teaching is concerned with general matters of humankind, the more philosophical language prevails, and any references to the Holy Scriptures is rather of an illustrative nature, an illuminating example, and not an assumption on which the argumentation is based. It is not by coincidence that so many papal documents dealing with social issues are not only addressed to members of the church, but to all people of goodwill. The language of the message is determined by the choice of addressee. Taking up the question of law as the basis of the rational order of interhuman relations, while remaining in line with his predecessors, John Paul II recalls Saint Thomas Aquinas and his classic teaching on natural law. However, he significantly develops this theory, emphasizing in man, above all, that which somehow elevates man above nature's order, bringing him to the very top of the order of creation. In exhortation Christi Fideles Laici we read, I quote, "Among all other earthly beings, only a man or a woman is a person, a conscious and free being, and precisely for this reason, the center and summit of all that exists on the earth. The dignity of the person is the most precious possession of an individual. As a result, the value of one person transcends all the material world. In virtue of a personal dignity, the human being is always a value as an individual, and as such demands being considered and treated as a person, and never, on the contrary, considered and treated as an object to be used, or as a means, or as a thing." It is hard not to notice that here the argumentation which modern thought owes to Immanuel Kant. John Paul II, otherwise well versed in Kant's thoughts, reaches for his moral works, integrating what is more true in Kant's philosophy into the social doctrine of the Church. One of such Kantian concepts, which is especially important nowadays, is the concept of freedom. And the problem of freedom is tightly bound to the issue of the law. The fundamental question arises: is freedom based on the obedience to the law, or on the contrary, it is above the law, being in itself an absolute source of the law? Freedom, or using Kant's terminology, man's autonomy, according to its Greek origins, autonomos, means that man makes his own laws. This opens a way of thinking about man, placing him not of the summit of the order of creation, but external to and above it. That is why the word autonomy may lead us astray. In the encyclical Veritas Splendors, we can find passages in which John Paul II points to both the lights and shadows of this concept. I quote, "The rightful autonomy of the practical reason means that man possesses in himself his own law, received from the Creator. Nevertheless, the autonomy of reason cannot mean that reason itself creates values and moral norms. Man's genuine moral autonomy in no ways means the rejection, but rather the acceptance of the moral law of God's command." End quote. Autonomy does not have to be based on the entirely arbitrary and sovereign establishment of one's own rules of conduct. It is, after all, possible to independently and autonomously, without being pushed or pressured by anyone else, cognize and discover the foundations of the existing order, and then to make them the source of one's own life principles. Man, as an autonomous being, simultaneously participates in a wider order created by God that incorporates him, which is why it might be more appropriate to speak not of his autonomy, but of his, as John Paul II says, participated theonomy. In contrast to the vision of man who is placed at the summit of the hierarchy of creation, who belongs to it, it is possible to find a radically different understanding of autonomy. The human person is then reduced to a self-projecting freedom, closing his eyes to the fact that he himself is rooted in nature's existing order and rejecting all responsibilities tied to this fact. John Paul II notes in Evangelium Vitae the absolutization of autonomy, which by extracting the individual from the broader context recognizes their claims as the only existing law, leads in fact to the understanding of interpersonal relations as a constant struggle and conflict. Meanwhile, the content of the established law also ceases to have any connection to rational reasons and turns out to merely be a resultant of the existing balance of forces. Despite the possibilities of abuse, it is precisely the autonomy of man, his freedom, which is an outstanding manifestation of the divine image in man, elevating him to the summit of the order of creation and giving him his unique dignity. This in turn results in certain rights, which are absolutely inherent to human beings, and which must be respected and protected in the well-organized life of states, taking the shape of appropriate regulations of the established law. These rights subsistent to every individual are, in other words, fundamental human rights. These rights, which in recent times have been ceremoniously written down in many declarations, but most notably in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, have generally found, despite certain and understandable historical resistance, the acknowledgement and acceptation of Catholic Church. On the 50th anniversary of its signing, John Paul II wrote the following. As its fundamental premise, the Declaration affirms that the recognition of the innate dignity of all members of the human family is also the equality and inalienability of their rights, is the foundation of liberty, justice, and peace in the world. The Universal Declaration is clear. It acknowledges the rights which it proclaims, but does not confer them, since they are inherent in the human person and human dignity. Consequently, no one can legitimately deprive another person, whoever they may be, of these rights, since this would do violence to their nature. All human beings, without exception, are equal in dignity. For the same reason, these rights apply to every stage of life and to every political, social, economic, and cultural situation. Together, they form a single whole directed unambiguously towards the promotion of every aspect of the good of both the person and society. When referring to human rights, John Paul II mentions that they are usually divided into categories. On the one hand, civil and political rights, and on the other, economic, social, and cultural rights. He does not, however, discuss the division further, as he was surely aware of the controversy that had arisen from including the second category in the basket of human rights. Instead, he proposes his own taxonomy of human rights, in which two of them play a fundamental role. I quote, the first of this is the basic right to life. Human life is sacred and inviolable from conception to its natural end. Thou shalt not kill. It's the divine commandment which states the limit beyond which it is never licit to go. End quote. All personal rights which protect the inviolability of the person, and in the proper proportion all which belongs to this person, that is, their existence, bodily integrity, property, are ultimately grounded in this very law. The second fundamental right is the right to religious freedom, which John Paul II calls the heart of human rights. I quote, religion expresses the deepest aspirations of the human person, shapes people's vision of the world, and affects their relationships with others. Basically, it offers the answer to the question of the true meaning of life, both personal and communal. Religious freedom, therefore, constitutes the very heart of human rights. Its inviolability is such that individuals must be recognized as having the right even to change their religion, if their conscience so demands. End quote. The Pope's emphasis on the key role that the respect of religious freedom plays in the world of interpersonal relations can only be a surprise to those who do not understand that the religious dimension is where the deepest aspiration of the human person appear. And the religious freedom, that is the freedom to search for that which man considers to be of the highest value and greatest good, is not only one of many freedoms, but is the quintessence of freedom itself. And on these two rights, the right to life and the right to religious freedom, all other just rights are based, both individual rights as well rights relating to the communal dimension of human life, to the family, the state as a political community, and to the rational organized network of international relations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, for these reflections. Before going to the next speaker, we can also maybe at the end reflect on the fact that maybe you've been mentioning people of goodwill, and I'm wondering on a practical level if natural law is not a consubstantial Christian concept, and how can it be applied and promoted in a de-Christianized society? A very healthy version of freedom, because nowadays in our Western societies there is a hatred for the very idea of natural rooting of norms, and they are entirely the product of human will. And it's like the democracy in America of Tocqueville is like reversed. Now there is the tyranny of the minorities, and everything is reversed. And one interesting reflection that we may have perhaps later during the Q&A would be to address also ways on a more practical level how to convince people of goodwill. You mentioned all these people of goodwill who are not necessarily Christian, how to convince them that natural law is intrinsically contained in their hearts. I think it is something we can discuss later, then the discussion, and for our next speakers as well.